On my 12th try, the spin was fast and I had enough height, so I shifted my weight and I threw it back, but it still felt like all the others. Then I realized, a little after the fact, that I was rolling across the flat bottom and up the other side of the ramp. After 13 years of trying unsuccessfully to land the 900, all I could think was, finally. I freaked out as a mob of my friends jumped onto the ramp and tackled me. They hoisted me on their shoulders and carried me around. I was about to explode. I was so happy. I'm usually a stoic guy, but more than a few people, my wife included, have commented that I'm hard to read. But that night, I let it go. I couldn't keep anything in. I thanked the crowd and announced, "This is the best day of my life." And this is an excerpt from the book we're going to talk about today, Hawk, Occupation Skateboarder by Tony Hawk.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you into the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Greg Young, and you've just heard from Dr. Duncan Simpson. As sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindsets, strategies and habits that propelled the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. Our goal is to help you learn from the history's greatest performers. For each episode, we read and then condense entire autobiographies into concentrated insights, representing over 20 hours of work per episode. So you not only gain the collective wisdom of these elite performers, but also access to over 30 years of our professional expertise in sports psychology. So listening to this, you're saving countless hours while accessing the distilled wisdom and proven strategies of the best in their fields. Duncan, I'm sure people all around the world are familiar with Tony Hawk, but tell us a little bit about his accomplishments.
So Tony Hawk was world champion for 12 consecutive years between 1984 and 1996, and that is in the vertical version of the sport, which is basically the ramp that everyone will be pretty familiar with, Greg. In terms of his professional career, Greg, he competed in 103 pro contests, winning 73 titles, placing second in 19, a record that remains unmatched, obviously. In terms of the X Games, Hawk participated in the X Games, further solidified his status, and won multiple gold medals, including in 1995 and in 1997. He completed the historic 900, which is the 900-degree spin that we just kind of heard in the introduction, in 1999 during the X Games, making Tony Hawk the first skateboarder in history to land a 900-degree aerial spin, a milestone in skateboarding history. In terms of business, he founded Birdhouse Skateboards in 1992. Birdhouse overcame early struggles to become a leading skateboard brand. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series, the video game, was launched in 1999. This iconic video game franchise became a cultural phenomenon. The remastered Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 set records, selling 1 million copies in 2 weeks. And in 1998, he founded Hawk Clothing, which is a children's skate apparel brand. So his influence goes far beyond the sport. Now, Greg, I'll admit my ignorance when it comes to skateboarding, but like many people, when you mention the sport, Tony Hawk is first and probably the only name that ever comes to mind. That's probably, for a lot of people, due to the video game, which we just mentioned, which really was a cultural phenomenon, introducing skateboarding to millions of people who had never even stepped on a board, including myself. I think he really transcends the sport. He's to skateboarding what Shaun White is to snowboarding, Kelly Slater is to surfing, and I would even go as far to say like Tiger Woods is to golf. His name isn't just recognized in skateboarding circles, it's really synonymous with the sport itself.
I'm glad you've admitted your ignorance and not made me call you out on your ignorance, but I am as equally ignorant as you are. But you're right, he does transcend the sport, and we do apologise in advance to all of the skateboarding fans who are listening, who are probably screaming at us, but we need to learn a little bit about the book here.
Even though Tony Hawk is incredibly famous, I realised that I actually knew very little about his journey and what it took for him to get there. The book is raw, it's honest, it's packed with life lessons, both about skateboarding and the relentless mindset that fueled his success in business. There's a fair amount about technical skateboarding in there. So if you're really into the sport, you'll love it. Go out and pick up the book yourself. We're not going to spend too much time on the technical side of skateboarding. Even if you're not interested in skateboarding, it's actually quite an accessible book, and it's really an inspiring read for anyone who wants to learn from one of history's greatest performers. So let's drop in. Greg, there's a little bit of skateboarding lingo for you.
That's a nice start. I appreciate that.
On May 12th, 1968, I made my entrance into the world. When I came home from Sharp Hospital in San Diego, both my sisters were already at college. Mom and Dad thought they were entering a nice, relaxing phase of their life when I interrupted. They lived comfortably in Sierra Mesa, California. My sister Lenore was 21, my sister Patricia was 18, and my brother Steve was 12. My parents had worked hard raising their 3 kids, and all of them were pretty mild-mannered until I made an appearance. I rebelled more as an infant than my brother and sisters did as teenagers. The main reason for their lack of rebellion stemmed from the fact that my parents supported whatever we kids did. Steve surfed, so my dad drove him to the beach every morning before school and sat in the car to watch until Steve was done. He also managed Pat's band and hauled music equipment to her gigs. My mom wasn't taking it easy either. She decided to go back to school when she was 38. She worked full-time, raised her kids, and took classes at night. When she was in her 50s, she earned her master's, and she was 62 years old when she finally earned her doctorate in education. We weren't your stereotypical family. Since my parents were fairly old when I came around, they'd outgrown the strict mom and pop rearing and slipped into the grandparent mentality. Mom thought everything I did was cute and I could do no wrong in my dad's eyes. This was surprising because he came from an extremely disciplined lifestyle. He'd been a Navy pilot and had flown bombing missions in World War II and the Korean War. He had won the Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 air medals, and a gold star. I'm sure my parents employed different child-raising techniques with my brothers and sisters, but they had less energy with me. It was easier for them to compromise than to fight. Greg, it sounds like he came from a pretty supportive family.
I love that phrase that they had less energy with me. Nice, polite way to call them old. Show me the environment that a child is raised in, and I will show you the person they'll become. So you're right, Tony grew up in an incredibly supportive and sounds like a very flexible family environment. But what's interesting here is how much that support evolved and changed over time. So his older siblings were raised with that very traditional structure. But by the time Tony's come along, his parents have not given in per se, but they've certainly softened in their approach. They've already been through that battle of raising kids and they've settled into what I really like. He's called a grandparent mentality. I know exactly what he means with that. Instead of enforcing that really strict discipline, as you perhaps expect from his dad with that military background, they've embraced quirks and passions, choosing a little bit perhaps compromise over conflict here. But here's the lesson that I think's there. Sometimes a little bit of freedom can actually be a really great gift for a parent to give. So Tony wasn't boxed into any set expectations or set structure. He's allowed to explore, he's allowed to fail, to really find his own path here. And it's interesting to consider that if his parents had perhaps been a little bit younger and more disciplined as they perhaps would be if they were younger, we might not have ever heard of Tony Hawk.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, obviously one we can't answer, but definitely one to contemplate. It just speaks again to the importance of the roles parents play in our performance journey, whether it's by accident or by design. Parents have played just such an influential role. So a little bit more about his parents and their kind of influence or lack of influence on Tony. Says, from the start, I knew I had my parents wrapped around my finger. Early on in life, I had learned the value of a temper tantrum. At school, I was aware of how far I could push things, and so I was mellow. Home was another matter, and my reign of terror continued. When I was older, my parents told me that they admired my determination and appreciated my need to question everything. They never scolded me because they felt that as tough as I was on everyone else, I was twice as tough on myself. By the time I entered the 2nd grade, I was really out of control. I couldn't sit still. Sitting, listening to a teacher talk about basic math made me feel like I had ants crawling all over me. I started to perform mini aerobic workouts at my desk, fidgeting nonstop. I couldn't switch off my frenzied movement. Luckily, this was the 70s, so the teacher didn't immediately diagnose me with ADD and stab a Ritalin-filled syringe into my butt the moment I acted up. My mum thought I was somewhat bright, what mom doesn't, and that my movements were due to a lack of stimulation. She had the school perform an IQ test on me. I don't even remember taking the test, but I scored 144, which placed me in the gifted, whatever that means, category. The teacher explained to my parents that my main problem was that I had a 12-year-old brain in an 8-year-old's body. Greg, Tony is really telling us here that, yes, he has a very high IQ, but it also seems like he has a very high EQ because he's able to manipulate his parents so well.
A very, very high IQ. But that's a great observation, Duncan. Clearly, he's got both intellectual intelligence, or what we consider IQ, and emotional intelligence, which for some strange reason always gets shortened to EQ. I've never fully understood that. So I think he's developed this from a young age, and he knows how to use it as a weapon, as it were, for him. So his IQ, given the ability to absorb and process information at a really, really rapid pace, which likely contributed to his restlessness in school. But it's his high EQ here, his awareness of people and how to influence them, that really stands out to me at this particular young age.
What stands out for me is a kid with really high IQ and EQ. It sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It sounds like real supervillain type material.
So Tony dabbled in basketball and baseball, and his dad was incredibly supportive and was actually his little league coach. But Tony admits that team sports weren't really for him, and he actually felt guilty letting other people down. So how did he stumble into skateboarding, you may ask, Greg?
How did he stumble into skateboarding, Duncan?
Oh, fantastic question. So he says, because my brother surfed religiously, he dabbled in skateboarding. In the late 60s, skateboarding was sidewalk surfing, and skaters mimicked surfers' style. When I was 6, Steve moved to Santa Barbara to study journalism. On one of his visits home from college, my brother pulled out of the garage an old skinny banana board that had a worn tail edge so sharp it was capable of slicing paper. I didn't know anything about skating, but we goofed around on it. Naturally, I became frustrated immediately and whined to Steve that I couldn't turn. He spent the rest of the day showing me carves and kick turns. Since he didn't use his board anymore, he gave it to me. I really didn't care. To me, it was just another play object like a Nerf football. If I couldn't find anything else to do, I would screw around on it for half an hour and then toss it back in the garage. I don't remember a skateboard rapture at the time, but something had begun to itch. I started skating a little more 6 months later with my 4th grade buddies. We'd skate around the neighborhood a couple of days a week, falling all over the place. The only facility I knew was the Oasis skate park, a 15-minute drive towards San Diego, directly under the 805 freeway overpass. I'd peer out the window every time we drove over. The place always seemed to be packed. The frenzied activity of hundreds of skateboarders hypnotized me. They looked like molecules in the middle of a nuclear reaction. Skateboarders whipped around in every direction, carving the balls and popping mini airs and inverts. I was surprised they never hit each other. I nagged my parents, moaning like a dying man about how badly I needed an Oasis membership. Greg, it isn't exactly love at first sight with skateboarding, but that seed has been planted and it kind of blossoms over those next 6 months.
That's exactly it. Skateboarding wasn't an instant passion for Tony Hawk, but he's had a bit of a taste here. It started just as another toy, something you use to pass the time when nothing else really seems interesting. But like many great pursuits, that obsession hasn't hit him all in one go. It's grown gradually. And I suppose passion doesn't always come in a lightning bolt formula, does it? Sometimes it's that slow burn that kind of sneaks up on you. So the key lesson here, for me, it's exposure and curiosity that really matter. Tony Hawk might never have touched a skateboard if his brother hadn't introduced it to him, and he might never have fallen in love with it if he hadn't seen what was possible at the Oasis skate park. You don't have to be in love with something from day one for it to change your life. Sometimes all it takes is trying something, sticking with it long enough, and just letting curiosity really do the rest.
Greg, you're exactly right. Passion doesn't often start as a fire, it starts as a flicker. There's something about curiosity. It doesn't demand commitment right away. It just asks you to explore, to try, to see where something might lead. And that's a lesson. You don't have to know right away if something is, quote unquote, your thing. The key is to stay open and explore different interests and allow yourself time to develop that deeper connection with things that excite you. And as you and I have talked about, my boy was just kind of mildly interested in football, soccer, when he started, despite my love of the game. He started probably 3 or 4 years ago. However, having seen the rough side of sport parenting myself, I really tried not to push him into it at all. And in this last, I'd say year and a half, his curiosity has transitioned into full blown obsession. Like he can't watch enough soccer or play enough soccer. And I really think it's just, not pushing people, letting them explore their curiosity. So eventually, his friend's mom decides to take a bunch of them to the Oasis skate park. And this is his reflection. He says, when skaters go to a skate park, it's like entering utopia. Yeah, there's lots of stinky and sweaty guys skating around, but it's our place. It's like the Elk Club for kids with scabs. Skaters carve around, pulling tricks that seemed impossible to me. I had entered another dimension, and I liked it a lot better than the one I was accustomed to. I skated everything, barely taking a break the whole day. It was a vacuum that sucked all my energy, and for the first time in my life, I actually felt content. It was an alien feeling. After moaning to my parents for a few days, my dad became my personal chauffeur a few times a week. I'm still not sure if my parents are being supportive or if they just welcomed the time away from me. My old friends lost interest in skating, and I lost interest in everything but skating. I barely saw them anymore. Spending all my time at the park changed my perspective on life. Greg, we're now hearing that transition from curiosity to absolute passion.
Exactly. This is the moment where we see curiosity starting to evolve into identity. So at first, skateboarding was just something that he's dabbled in. But once he stepped into that skate park, everything's clicked for him. It wasn't just something new anymore. He's found that sense of belonging, I think. And the skate park isn't just a place to practice. It sounds like it's a culture, it's a community, it's a lifestyle. It's something that's organic almost, living and breathing. But I think there is an important lesson here, and that is that deep passion isn't passive. It really does require full commitment. So he doesn't just skate occasionally, he's living and breathing this. As he says, he's sacrificed old friendships, he's reshaped priorities, and really thrown himself headfirst into this new world. One thing that really stands out to me is how competitive skateboarding, so where performances are judged subjectively, that naturally fosters creativity. So, in contrast to purely objective sports like some of the ones we've covered on performers in previous episodes, like running, tennis, football, soccer, where success is measured on times or on points or on goals, skateboarding requires both that technical skill and artistic impression. You can argue the same about gymnastics to a degree, but what I think separates that from skateboarding is that in skateboarding, the judges decide what's cool and what's difficult, and it's not really a set of really strict guidelines and historic traditions that you might see in gymnastics. So in that sense, it almost sits at the crossroads between the traditional athletes like we've covered, like Agassi, Drew Brees, Des Linden, and the artists that we've covered like Prince and Will Smith to this point. So I think a great skateboarder isn't just physically gifted, they're also incredibly creative, constantly pushing boundaries, testing the limits of style, innovation, self-expression.
Yeah, I really love that, how skateboarding kind of sits between the competitive sports, the traditional sports, and the real artists that we've covered. And it's really a great segue because his new commitment to skateboarding, he doesn't have time or interest in basketball or baseball. So he quits despite his dad being the coach, and his dad's actually okay with it. So this change of priorities also comes with a change of attitude from Tony. And he says, I noticed a change in my attitude once I started skating more. I don't know what exactly caused the exorcism of my evil self, but I remember thinking one day, I'm tired of being a jerk to my parents. It was a conscious decision, as if one of my schizophrenic voices had instructed me. Skating became the black hole of my life. Every day I doodled skateboarding in school, skated in the house, and skated anywhere nearby. My obsession with skateboarding could black out the rest of the world. Greg, I don't think it's a stretch to say that skateboarding provided what it sounds like a real viable outlet for his high IQ and EQ. In other words, maybe he found his why or his purpose in life here.
Well, that's exactly it. It's not just a hobby anymore. It's become his vehicle for really channeling that energy, that intelligence, and all the emotions that come along for the ride with that. Before skating, that high IQ and high EQ has really manifested in ways that made him restless and a bit, shall we say, difficult to handle. But once he's immersed himself in that skating and in that culture, all that intensity now has a constructive direction. So instead of competing against other people or testing the boundaries at home with his parents, he started to compete against himself and pushing his own limits and setting his own standards and finding a real deep sense of fulfillment in that process. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with that great quotation, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act but a habit, usually attributed to Aristotle. But the more you do something over and over and over again and become entwined with that culture and that practice, it does become a habit. And I think that's taking them in the right direction.
So many great takeaways there, Greg. And like we've seen with many of our other performers, his dad plays such a crucial role in nurturing and supporting the passion that Tony had. And he says, I had no clue there were skate parks all over Southern California. I came to the realization that within a 2-hour drive, I could hit 10 of them, and I did. My poor dad logged hundreds of miles every weekend driving me from park to park. My competitiveness flared up and I began focusing on strategies to do well. This was serious. Before every contest, I would skate the park and figure out what tricks I could do there. At home, I'd draw the competition ball on a piece of paper and then I'd write a numbered list of tricks I'd do. I'd place the numbers on the diagram to show where I planned to do each trick. For a week, I would visualize my run over and over in my head, etching it into my memory.
Duncan, a few things stand out here. Firstly, for Tony, it's all about right place, right time. You know, he's grown up in Southern California. It's the late 60s and 70s, and it's the very birthplace of skateboarding, just as the sport was exploding. So let's not forget that Southern California is the undisputed home of skateboarding, particularly in cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, and Venice Beach as well. The region's year-round sunshine, beautiful climate, surf culture that comes hand in hand with that, really cutting-edge skate parks and facilities made that the perfect playground, the perfect incubator for the sport's evolution. And I think this also speaks to a broader truth that, as I mentioned earlier, we are shaped by our environment and the opportunities that the environment affords us. Lindsey Vonn, if you remember back, had access to Buck Hill Ski Mountain in Minnesota, which is a proving ground for future Olympians. Bubba Watson, he grew up surrounded by golf courses in Florida. Drew Brees was raised in football-obsessed Texas. Dan Carter, the famous rugby player, honed his skills in a country, New Zealand, which is absolutely rugby mad. So the pattern that we're seeing is absolutely clear. That greatness is often born from the right mix of passion, of access, and of opportunity. And furthermore, I think two other themes stick out as well. The support and preparation. His dad was obviously actively invested, driving him from park to park, hundreds of miles in the car, and ensuring that he had the opportunities to be able to refine and practice his craft. And that kind of dedication from a parent can and does make all of the difference, not just in providing that access, but in reinforcing that belief. When someone's willing to go that far, literally for you, it validates that what you're doing matters. And then there's the preparation part of it. So he's not just winging it. Even as a kid, he's very strategic. He's mapping out his runs. He's visualizing and going through his head what he wants to do every time he has a run. And he's approaching that competition with a real intentional mindset. And that level of detail and mental rehearsal is something that we've seen in many of our elite performers to date. So what's the key lesson here? I think talent alone isn't enough. Greatness is built on structure, it's built on strategy, and it's built on a real willingness to put in that unseen work long before that performance actually arrives.
That's just a phenomenal monologue by you, Greg. There's so much gold in there. But despite this preparation, he actually still struggles with nerves. And he says, as much as my map making prepared me for competitions, it did nothing to calm my nerves. I was visibly scared before contests. My anxiety sometimes made me shake. It never really mattered to me if I won, but whether I skated up to my expectations. I'd get so pissed at myself for bailing a trick. I wouldn't want to be around people. I obsessed about my mistakes and withdrew into myself. Sometimes I won, but if I didn't skate as well as I'd hoped, I'd also have the grump. Other times I didn't win, but I skated up to my expectations and I'd be euphoric. By the end of the first year of competition, I'd managed to beat back my nerves and win my age group. Greg, even the best are not immune to nerves, as we've heard over and over again. But the key here is that even though he's young, he's really persisted through those nerves.
Exactly. He hasn't let fear stop him here. He skated through those nerves and the frustration and the self-criticism that comes along with really wanting to be an elite performer. So what's important here is he doesn't eliminate his anxiety, he doesn't eliminate that fear. He learns to manage it by repeatedly basically putting himself in those high-stakes situations and meeting it head on. So the lesson here is that confidence isn't that absence of nerves, it's the ability to perform despite the presence of them. So many people assume that elite performers are these fearless robots, but in reality, they feel the same pressure as everyone else does. They're just humans. The difference is that they don't let it dictate their actions for the most part. I think, interestingly, for Tony Hawk, he wasn't afraid of losing. He was afraid of not meeting his own expectations, his own standards. And this is, again, is a mindset that we've seen in many elite performers that we've talked about. The highs of executing well is something that's fueled him, but the lows also kind of consumed him, making him withdraw into himself and obsessing over those mistakes. So this really is a double-edged sword, right? You've got these high standards that are the drive and the platform for greatness. But if you leave those things unchecked, they can also lead to frustration and, as we've seen with some athletes as well, burnout.
And of course, with that preparation, he becomes pretty successful. And at the age of 12, he starts getting some equipment sponsorship with a company called Powell, and he joins a team. And he's only 12, but a lot of the other riders are in their late teens and early 20s. And he says, at 12, I became the youngest member of the Bones Brigade. 5 years age difference isn't a big deal when you're in your 20s. But at age 12, these guys were straight up intimidating. They never did anything to make me feel inferior. I did it all myself. Surprisingly, on team rivalry was non existent. Whoever won, we were all supportive. I was still an amateur, and because I was so much younger, the team rooted for me even more, which made me feel like crap for letting them down when I sucked. I sucked for a while. Once Pal sponsored me and began taking me to national contests, the level of skating shot up. Greg, I don't think we can underestimate the importance of having a welcoming team environment here at such a young age. However, he still has to step up in terms of performance. He's going to big competitions, and his first big competition was actually in Jacksonville, and it does not go well. Luckily for him, Stacy, the team manager, who is also a former skater himself, understood that Tony was really still developing, and he knew it would take time. And Stacy plays such a critical role in his life, and he really nurtures him. And furthermore, while he's struggling in competition, he's also struggling to fit in with school, especially during his early teenage years, where he was very small and skinny for his age. And of course, his body was covered in scabs and bruises from his skateboarding. So he didn't quite look the part. And as such, he was bullied constantly at school. And he says, skateboarding saved me. As humiliating as school was, my life rotated around Del Mar and other skaters. If I'd been dependent on school for a social life, I'd have been seriously depressed. My obsession prevented me from making scholastic friends, and a life at the skate park overrode any sort of school socializing. I maintained good grades and attended advanced math and English classes, but I usually just put my head down, did my schoolwork, and headed straight to the skate park after school. Greg, it's pretty sad because he does get bullied at school.
Yeah, it is. We've heard this, I think, for a couple of our individual sport athletes, but it's on the positive side, it's really a testament to the power of having a passion that gives you that purpose. Skateboarding, it's obviously becoming more than just an activity for him. It's a lifeline in a world where he isn't really judged for his size or for his bruises or the way his clothes fit, but for his skill and his commitment. And it didn't change, obviously, the bullying, but it gave him something bigger to focus on and maybe a little bit more of an outlet. And for a lot of people who feel like outsiders, that's the difference between being swallowed by hardship and mental health issues and finding a way forward.
So, Greg, he does in fact find a way forward. And in 1982, a few months after his 14th birthday, he turned pro for PAL. So, before he was kind of getting a little bit of free equipment, but now he's a professional. And he says, I didn't have a burning desire to. And it wasn't like today or in the mid 80s when professional skateboarder meant you were getting paid serious money. In the early 80s, a pro skater couldn't make a decent living. And I was only 14 years old. I lived at home, didn't need a car, and couldn't find a date with a compass. What did I need money for? But Stacy felt I was ready. To put early 80s skating into perspective, imagine being a professional frisbee player today. That's the equivalent of a pro skater back then. In my first contest, I placed third. There were at least 18 people in the stands watching my professional debut, and I didn't win any money.
And I love the saying, where you start has no impact on where you'll end up. So he started with 18 people in the stands, and as we know, he finishes up on ESPN and the X Games.
Yeah, and he actually really struggles early in his career, Greg, as you'd expect for a 14-year-old. But he doesn't give up, and he says, after getting my butt kicked my first time in Jacksonville and at a few other contests, I'd figured I'd better learn how to adapt. I hated the disgusting feeling I'd get when I didn't skate the way I'd expected. Luckily, the following year, I grew a bit and gained a few pounds, and when I started concentrating on adapting to different terrain, I skated better in contests. I began winning for a change. And he wasn't just winning, but he was also doing it, Greg, with a slightly different style, which I know you know all about in terms of your.
Oh, I mean, I don't want to bore you with the nuance here, so we can keep it very surface level just for your own sanity.
Thank you very much. And he says, my winning helped usher in a newer style of skating. More emphasis was placed on innovative tricks than on carving and pushing the basic tricks into laid back grinds.
Exactly. That's exactly how I was going to put it too.
From then on, the new school skaters gained recognition. I wasn't exactly loved in professional skateboarding world. From the start, I'd always skated differently from the rest of the skaters. I'd invent my own weird tricks like finger flip airs and varial gay twists. Because of my flippy tricks, I became known as a circus skater. I hated my style. People ripped on it constantly. So, Greg, even though he's actually having some success, he's not comfortable with his identity inside the skateboarding world. Again, he's still very young here too.
I agree. Can you talk us through a finger air flip just for our dear listeners?
Well, can you talk me through a variable gay twist?
Not with this podcast rating, I can't. You're absolutely right. Yeah, success doesn't always equal that acceptance within that group. So, what is a real lesson that we can take from this? Innovation comes with resistance. That's just par for the course. When you do something differently, whether that's in sports, whether it's in business, or any other field that you care to mention, you're going to face pushback, particularly by those who've been part of the establishment for a while. So Tony's learned to skate that way because he didn't have the frame and he didn't have enough power to be, I think, what's referred to as a power skater. So he's had to develop his own unique style. So we've talked about necessity is always the mother of invention. We've said that over and over and over here. Progress, it always looks weird at first, but the people who shape industries and redefine sports like he's doing here are just revolution ideas. They're often criticized before they're celebrated. So his early struggles with his identity as a skater, that's proof that being different isn't a weakness. It's usually a sign that you're onto something bigger. There's a great quotation from Ted Lasso. He says, taking on a challenge is a lot like riding a horse. If you're comfortable while you're doing it, you're probably doing it wrong. And I think that's what we're experiencing here.
Another great takeaway, Greg. And yes, while he feels like a bit of an outsider in the skateboarding world, he is definitely an outsider at school. But he continues to get good grades. A 144 IQ certainly helps. And he plans to go to college because nobody made a decent living from skateboarding back then. Eventually, he convinces his parents he needs to move schools. And his new school was actually a bit more accepting of him and his alternative lifestyle. And even the new principal knew a little bit about his skateboarding and his accomplishments. They'd seen him in the newspaper, and the new principal actually thought it was kind of cool. So Tony definitely felt a little bit of an uptick at the new school. At the same time, he's also getting more and more invested into sports. So do his parents. And he says, I wouldn't change anything about my parents' involvement with skating, but I'd be lying through my two fake front teeth if I said it didn't cause me some discomfort. On the other hand, my dad organized competitive skateboarding and laid the foundation for contests as we know them today, whether you like that or not. It came naturally for my dad to do everything possible to help his kids. And he outdid himself when he started the National Skateboard Association, which is the NSA.
Not the NSA that most people are thinking about here.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
the National Security Agency or Administration, but the National Skateboarding Association.
And I will further reference it as the NSA just for context moving forward. So, in the beginning of 1983, Dad met with some companies, recruited some volunteers, and opened shop. This was the first unified organization that had the support of all the major skateboard companies. Before the NSA, contests were scattered all over the place, and there was no unified ranking system. I didn't know how to act around my parents, and in a way, I felt violated. They were forcibly entering my private world. Skating was my utopia where I fit in and where I could solve my own problems. It got me to think for myself. Now my parents had infiltrated my private world. It took years for me to become comfortable with them being at almost every contest I entered. I was a teenager, so I didn't want to be around my parents anyway. I had some serious inner conflict raging inside. On the one hand, I was grateful. On the other, I wanted my space back. Greg, there's a really interesting paradox in there.
There certainly is. It's a classic case of gratitude and resentment, which are usually diametrically opposed and they're really coexisting at the same time. So it sounds very much like Tony. He knows that his dad's efforts are really instrumental in shaping competitive skateboarding. Without them, there wouldn't be an organized structure for the sport to grow and perhaps even be what we know it to be today. But at the same time as that, skateboarding has been Tony's escape, and it's his personal world where he didn't have to conform, he could think for himself, and where he wasn't being watched or judged by that sort of traditional authority figures, including his own parents. So when his dad stepped into this role, even with, of course, the best of intentions, it sounds like it's very much felt like an intrusion. So support, even when it is well-intentioned, can sometimes feel like the hand of control. So there's a fine line here between helping and overstepping. And for a teenager who's really trying to carve out that identity for himself, even the most positive parental involvement, it can feel unintentionally suffocating. So I think Tony's eventually found peace with his dad's role in skateboarding, but it has taken time for that to develop. Sometimes we only fully appreciate the people who helped us once we've gained enough distance from that time point to be able to see that bigger picture.
Yeah, and I am going to take a step back and reiterate to the listeners, Tony Hawk's dad set up the National Skateboarding Association, and he had no background in skateboarding. And then Tony obviously goes on to reshape the sport. So there's just something really crazy there. I think being a parent is really a thankless task. Tony did get shit from the other skateboarders because, of course, he wins the first ever NSA event that his dad puts on.
His dad wasn't the head judge, was he?
No, but everyone was saying it was rigged. However, over time, people actually began to feel differently about his dad, but it did take time for Tony to accept. And he says, gradually skaters began appreciate my parents' devotion to the sport and became close friends with them. My parents helped skaters out whenever they could. They'd pick them up from airports, give them rides to contests, or let them stay at our house and feed them. We regularly had 20 skaters staying at our house during local contests. Skaters slept in bathtubs, closets, the garage. Our house would look like a skater bomb had exploded. When my dad was sick with cancer in 1997, some of the skaters he'd yelled at the hardest visited and expressed their thanks. Not for running the NSA, but for helping them out during tough times in their lives. Cards, phone calls, and visits flooded in from the rawest, punkiest skaters in the world. But the visits were years away in 1983, when skaters only knew my father as a yelling dictator. So, Greg, again, in the book, Tony kind of outlines how instrumental his dad was in shaping the professionalism of the sport through the NSA. His dad never made a lot of money from it. Rather, he did it kind of all through supporting his son's passion. It wasn't a business interest for him. He saw the need to actually add structure to the sport. And despite the fact he had no background in the sport, he decided to kind of go all in. And I actually think that's really cool.
Yeah, I think that is really cool. One of the sort of maxims that I really love is a society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit, which is a old school Greek proverb. But I love that. People just doing things for the betterment, not getting anything out of it themselves in the immediate short term, but knowing that it's going to have massive implications down the line for other people. I think that's a huge commitment for his dad, and obviously commended for that as well.
Yeah, his dad never really took much money out of that at all. And talking of money, the money started flooding in for Tony Hawk. So he's a professional now, and he says, I ran inside, tore the envelope open, and stared at my check for 85 cents. I'd made less than $1 in my first month as a professional skater. That means one person in the whole world had bought my board that month, and he or she didn't buy a t-shirt or a sticker.
Cheapskates.
I guess ollieing into airs hadn't caught on yet. I received another check a few months later for $4.25, so things were looking up financially.
Rockefeller.
5 people had bought my board. So, Greg, despite the lack of money, he does get to go on tour during summer holidays. And remember, he's still in high school here, so this is kind of cool. He says, school was out, which translated into 2 solid months of skating. I spent the summer skating at demos in Australia, Europe, Canada, and across the United States. Skating was ever so slowly gaining popularity, and the demo crowds swelled from 50 to 60 spectators to more than 100. The weird thing was the Jekyll and Hyde lifestyle I'd lived. At school, I was mocked and abused, while in the skateboarding world, I signed autographed, sold products with my name all over it, and actually began to generate some interest among girls. I was far too timid, though, to return their affection. I know their attention was mostly due to my position in skating. but beggars can't be choosers. At 15 years old, his boards actually start selling better with his famous hawk skull with a cross in the background, which his friend had really quickly sketched up. And the Bones Brigade, as we mentioned earlier, the skate team, were involved in a somewhat underground skater video, which helped to support the board sales. And he actually begins to pull in some decent money. He starts to pull in around $3,000 a month. He's also having a lot of success in skating itself. And at the end of 1983, he was declared the first NSA world champion, and he's 15 years old.
So you're saying all I needed is for my dad to set up a league and I could have been a world champion?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No favorites.
Yeah. I like how you said it was just a little bit of money. $3,000 a month for a 15-year-old's not doing badly.
Yeah, he's doing all right. So jumping ahead, and by 1985, he continues to grow physically. He's now 6 foot, but he's still 135 pounds.
Yeah, that's a skeleton a t-shirt, isn't it?
Yes. But he also wins the NSA championship for a third year in a row in 1985.
Thanks, Dad.
Now remember, he's also a senior in high school, so he's a 3-time world champion and a senior in high school. And he says, "My grades took a beating during my senior year. Millions of people in California alone were skating, and I was one of the most popular skaters in the world. Requests for demos would pour in every month, and I had commercial shoots with companies like Mountain Dew. As such, money does start to pour in eventually, and he buys a house, and his dad has to co-sign for the house because he's only 17 years old. And he says, a few months before graduation, I moved in, now as an 18-year-old with my own bachelor pad. A weird thing happened during my last month of school. I became famous. The Mountain Dew ad aired on television in heavy rotation, and it seemed like all my schoolmates saw it. Word got around I'd bought a house, and people began coming up to me in the hallways and starting conversations with me. It felt like an acid trip. This was a different school from the one I had experienced."
It's weird how fame, a little bit of money in your own house seems to have a positive impact on your popularity in high school.
Yeah, you're not wrong. His popularity certainly did soar, and it didn't end there. And he says, when I was 18, demos translated into girls, skating, and parties. Drive to the next demo and repeat. The monotony of touring is what kills you. Partying was the strongest tour antidote. However, things do begin to change, and he says, I began to hate skating in contests. In a lot of people's eyes, if I didn't win an event, then I simply lost. I just wanted to do my best and enjoy skating, but the incessant pressures made me want to quit competing. It's only natural to want a team or person who wins a lot to lose. I saw it with the Chicago Bulls when they're on top. Since 1984, people have told me that I lost a contest if I didn't come in first. Some of the magazines and skaters, and even the head NSA judge, Brian Ridgway, thought I was being judged against myself rather than other skaters. If I did a trick no one else did, but had done it in the past 3 contests, it didn't count as much or wasn't as impressive as the first time. If another skater did the same trick I did, he scored higher. Brian told me that even though he instructed his judges to raise all their expectations as skaters, he felt that if I did a trick like a 720 in competition, it counted the same as somebody else's 540. I grew sick of skating in contests and having people only pay attention to how I placed. It got to be so mundane. Not for me necessarily, but for everyone else involved. I'd had enough. So, Greg, we're really hearing what I'd say is a shift in expectations and a change in kind of that love for the sport.
I'd have to agree. It's a shift that happens to almost every dominant, I think is a good word, dominant performers at some point. Early on, he comes in and he's an underdog and he's young and he's pushing the limits of what's really possible in skateboarding. But once he's become the standard, as it were, those expectations shift and they change. He's no longer competing against other skaters. He's competing against his own past performances, almost like a ghost of himself. And that's a brutal place to be because every success raises that bar higher and higher and higher. So the same thing that once made him revolutionary starts to feel expected. And it's important to realize that sustained excellence often leads to a diminishing return in recognition. So when you're new and you're innovative, everything that you do is celebrated and people are blown away by it. But over time, people get used to that greatness and it takes even more to impress them every single time. So I think that's why elite performers, whether that's sports people or business people, or even someone like Will Smith, who's in entertainment, they often have to constantly reinvent themselves to stay relevant. Tony Hawk wasn't losing his skill. If anything, his skill was getting better and better. But what he was losing was that ability to surprise people. And when external validation becomes tied to the novelty of something rather than the mastery of something, it's really easy to feel trapped in a cycle where that great thing that you're doing oddly is never good enough.
Yeah, I think you're right. The novelty of excellence does wear off. And with it comes a kind of an entirely new pressure. I think some of the greatest performers we've covered, Michael Phelps, Lindsey Vonn, Lance Armstrong, maybe Mike Tyson early in his career, Simone Biles, they reached such a level of success where winning, like you said, wasn't just expected, it was assumed. Their dominance was so complete that a single loss wasn't just a setback, it became a story, something that's actually dissected and debated. I mean, think back to Mike Tyson versus Buster Douglas. So instead of being celebrated for their continued greatness, they're actually scrutinized the moment they show any sign of kind of human weakness. So, Greg, I was thinking about this, and complete dominance removes that unpredictability from sports. And that's actually what fans want. They don't want to see just complete dominance from one person or one team. They want to have unpredictability. So, with all this pressure and with nothing really left to prove, he considers retirement at 19 years of age. He speaks to his brother and to Stacy, who's the team manager, and they're both actually very supportive and understanding. Stacy does encourage him to just kind of, stop practicing and just go to competition and give it everything. Really focus on competition. Don't worry too much about the practice. Less emphasis on practice really took the pressure off him. And he decided, look, I'm going to continue to skate. So he doesn't end up retiring at 19. So, Greg, this next section, I'm going to paraphrase a pretty large section of the book to help advance the story. The popularity of skateboarding is surging, and there's demos and tours that are really well attended. There was also the rise of street skating in the 1980s, which was really that creative alternative. And it was kind of skaters who didn't have access to parks. So, street skating is what we would assume it is, right? Skating anywhere you could. And while many vert skaters, which are the people who go on the ramps, which was Tony, so street skating was gaining popularity and really starts to overtake vert in 1989. And there's a lot in the book about different companies, and they're all vying for control of skateboarding. And there's ultimately these kind of turf battles between skaters from different factions of the business. And ultimately, there's just a lot of negativity filing into the sport during this time. So he gives kind of insight here, and he says, when I started skating, everyone who skated was part of a whole. There was a closeness due to being outcasts. Being a skater was enough. You didn't have to be cool or wear the right skate gear. By 1989, that had changed, and a bit of the too cool mentality had crept in. Being a skater wasn't enough anymore. You had to be a cool skater. Even though I was ranked number one in the world, I never thought I was the best in the world. I'd grown up winning contests and having people bash my style, so I knew a lot of people didn't think of me as the best skater. Because of my rank, the fastest way to get to the top would be to take me out. So the magazines and the other people took the pre-existing rivalry between us and turned it into a soap opera. Greg, this seems to be kind of a fundamental shift in what skateboarding was all about.
Yeah, it's a major turning point. Skateboarding no longer is just about the love of the sport. It's now got that real strong identity and image and competition in a way there that it hadn't necessarily been before. In the early days, as he mentioned, skaters were unified by that kind of that outsider status. They were always part of that out group, as it were. So for Tony, it sounds very much like the shift is especially tough. Despite being the number one ranked skater in the world, he never feels fully accepted. And that's just wild in my mind to think about that. He's always been criticized for what he described earlier as that unique style. And now, as that industry continues to evolve and the people in that industry continue to evolve, that judgment only sort of sits there and intensifies. The sport's grown, obviously, but in doing so, it seems like it's lost some of the raw authenticity that made it that really special place in the first place.
Well, as we saw in our last episode with Will Smith, what goes up must come down. And it says, by 1990, everybody involved with skating began looking up to see when the sky was going to fall. For reasons nobody has ever been able to fully explain, skateboarding's popularity goes in cycles of roughly 9 years. Since the early 70s, it has exploded and then fizzled out at the beginning of every decade. It died shortly after I started skating in the late 70s, then kicked back into gear in the mid 80s, and then died again in the early 90s. But in 1990, the industry felt the weight of rapidly declining sales, and then suddenly skaters weren't everywhere you looked. Skating wasn't dead yet, but we were worried about the future. The sport seemed to have had its day. The outlaw image, the difficulty getting insurance for skate parks, and the lack of mainstream exposure was helping to lead to its demise.
That's interesting, Duncan. I don't think we've seen this kind of whole industry collapse with any of our other performers, certainly none in the mainstream sports that we've talked about. If anything, their performance domains we've covered have only expanded and continue to expand. Bigger audiences, higher stakes, more opportunities that kind of grow and get exponentially bigger over time. This is weird to me, this sort of boom and bust cycle that seems really unique in that way. It's not just about that individual success, but whether the sport itself can actually sustain its own momentum.
You're right. And during this time, he also gets married to his fiancee, Cindy, and they have their first child, Riley. And it's also bad timing because his royalty checks actually start to dry up.
Oh, how's he going to cope without that strong 85-cent income?
Well, he's earning a little more by this stage.
Fair enough.
The contests were getting cancelled. The NSA begins to flounder. By 1991, things financially were not looking good for Tony Hawk at all, even though he became the NSA Vert World Champion for the 10th year in a row. His own skateboard company, Birdhouse, was really struggling between 1991 and 1993. So, again, 10-time world champion. And as he mentions in the book, he is really struggling financially. They actually end up trying to live on $5 a day, and he's eating, I think, Taco Bell like 3 times a day. So he's struggling at this point. And he says, skating's popularity was lower than I ever thought was possible. Birdhouse was losing money, and there was only a handful of vert skaters left. My style of skating was becoming dated, and I was scared of being left in the dust by the new breed. I anticipated 1994 would be the year when skating picked up. I was still living on my Birdhouse salary and making very little money from demos. I did most demos for free just to promote Birdhouse. Sometimes I even lost money. One time I traveled to France to skate a demo for $300. They screwed up the reservation so that my scheduled return flight left before the actual event, and it cost me $400 to change the ticket. They refused to pay the difference, citing that the most of the crowd is sneaked in without even paying for the event.
Very on brand for the French again.
Yeah, exactly. The French. Oh, man. So, Greg, we've touched the unglamorous side of performance before, and we're hearing it again here with Tony Hawk.
We are. This is about as unglamorous as it gets by the sound of it. And, this is a stark reminder that even the best in the world are simply not immune to financial struggles and industry downturns and peaks and troughs and all that good stuff. We often think that elite performers, they're thriving indefinitely and it's just constant, hockey stick growth. But we see with Tony Hawk, one of the biggest names, if not the biggest name in skateboarding, barely scraping by. He's a 10-time world champion, as you say, and he's still got to do free demos. He's got to lose money on trips, and he's got to watch his own company struggle to survive. It really is that unglamorous side of performance that rarely gets talked about, but it's always sort of lurking there in the background. Those moments of uncertainty, reinvention, financial instability that even the greatest athletes of all time, they've got to navigate it. You can have it all, but you can't have it all at once. And you've said that time and time again.
And around this time in 1994, with kind of financial struggles in the background, he splits from Cindy. They end up pretty amicable and they have equal custody of their child, Riley. And he meets Erin, who will become his next wife. Unfortunately, his dad, as you might have heard earlier, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So things are definitely rocky in his personal life. And then this happens. A few months before summer, rumors of a weird new television event rumbled around the industry. ESPN was supposedly planning an Olympic-style event with all the peripheral action sports. Skateboarding, BMX, and rollerblading were all going to compete on a new show called... Can you guess, Greg?
Gladiators? No, it's got to be the X Games.
Correct, the X Games. And it was actually originally called the Extreme Games, which Tony says is an awful name that still can't be shaken. And he says, this was huge, but you've got to understand that skaters are inherently wary of outside interest in the sport. Needless to say, Skaters and industry people were split as to whether the event was a good thing or bad. Ever since skating started over 30 years ago, the mainstream media have consistently misrepresented us. Commercials and movies have presented us as a bunch of rebellious clowns, many still do, and rarely have understood the subculture. So although the skate industry was interested in the X Games, they were worried about being misrepresented in such a huge forum. Well, Tony does enter the X Games, and of course, he wins the vert contest and places second in street skating. So, a little more about that, and he says the contest aired a week later, and the amount of exposure it generated was amazing. People began to recognize me on the street, in the mall, and in video stores. I'd been recognized before, but it had always been by skateboarders. Now civilians came up to me as they'd seen me on television. I was happy that my dad was alive to see me skating on television in front of millions. He, more than anybody, appreciated the exposure, and it validated everything he'd done for the sport. He knew there were problems with the event, but it granted him unimaginable bragging rights. He told people I was going to be more popular than Michael Jordan. After the Extreme Games, Birdhouse sales shot up, and at the start of the year, Airwalk had decided to produce Tony Hawk signature shoes. Greg, there's real serendipity here for Tony. Just when literally everything is going to shit, ESPN and the X Games turns up.
Yeah, it's one of those moments where timing and opportunity have just perfectly aligned. Just as Tony's struggling, the X Games arrive and change everything. And for the first time, I think Tony wasn't just a legend within skateboarding. This is his route to becoming a household name. So sometimes life is just about being persistent and being ready when the right opportunity presents itself. And I'm struggling to think whether ESPN2 and ESPN3 would even exist without the X Games. It seems like every time you turn one of those channels on, that's what you see in front of you in some shape, form, or fashion. And it's evolved and got bigger and bigger and bigger, of course.
That's a great take. So jumping ahead, he marries Erin in 1996, and the X Games, despite really changing his life, also brought some issues with them. And he says, the next year marked the time when the Extreme Games reared up like a two-headed beast. Skating was growing so quickly it was almost out of control by 1997. The mainstream media jumped in the middle of everything in a feeding frenzy. My name and image was right up there tied to the X Games. They decided to change their name that year. Smart move. 6 months before the contest, I was fielding interview requests for the games. Birdhouse was selling thousands of decks a month, and I had to turn down demos I wanted to do because I was overbooked. Birdhouse Projects was now a legitimate company, and we could afford to tour on a decent budget. One thing that sucked was that my ESPN exposure overshadowed the rest of the team. When we hit a town, the newspapers only wanted to talk to me.
Duncan, the X Games here, they've given skateboarding as a whole, and by proxy, obviously, Tony, a massive platform here. But with that exposure comes again a renewed weight of expectation, new media demands, and the somewhat unintended or at least unforeseen consequences of fame, which we've seen with a bunch of our other athletes and performers. Also, because skateboarding had exploded so fast that it was becoming something different and something harder to control, suddenly, it's not about the sport anymore. It's about the business and the industry of skateboarding and the image of skateboarding, and now the marketability of that big star, that Michael Jordan, as it were. And that's the catch-22 of being a pioneer. You do open those doors for others, but sometimes you end up standing in the way of them as they're trying to come through without meaning to. Fame can be really isolating, even when it's built on something that you love and you're passionate and you care so deeply about. So he spent years of fighting for skateboarding's, is it legitimacy? Is that the right word here? And now it's here. It comes with complications that he just wasn't able to anticipate.
Yeah, heavy is the head that wears the crown, and I think it's a difficult place for him. But at the same time, in 1998, Birdhouse was now one of the most popular skate companies, and he was getting, as he calls it, ridiculous and lucrative offers from all over the world. So,
I wish people would give me some ridiculous and lucrative offers.
exactly. However, starting the 1999 season, he knew it was actually going to be his last year competing, and that he'd actually kind of shift over into an unofficial ambassador role for the sport and be that face of the sport. However, the sport wasn't done with him yet. And he says, Since the early 90s, most skaters figured that nobody would land a 900 anytime soon, but every vert skater knew it was the trick to shoot for. We had learned 540s and then 720s, but the extra 180 degree needed for a 9 was a nightmare. I felt I couldn't wind myself up that much and still maintain control. The biggest problem was it wasn't a trick you could practice for a week because it killed you. After 10 or so attempts, you felt as if you'd walked away from a car crash. So the next time I gave it any thoughts was at the 99 X Games, and I'm glad I did. So, Greg, it's no great surprise because this is how we open up the show today, but of course he completes the 9, short for 900, on the biggest stage at the X Games.
Duncan, I remember us mentioning that Dana White once said, the UFC sell holy shit moments, and this was the holy shit moment for the X Games. It's the biggest star of the sport doing a trick that nobody in history had ever done before on their show. It couldn't have gone better for them.
Newspaper after newspaper wrote articles about me. Sports programs showed the 9 and their highlight reels. Surreal. My schedule filled up with interviews, and television shows filmed segments about me. Old ladies, jocks, waiters and waitresses, policemen, security guards, and entire families congratulated me on landing the 900. I did think about retiring after the 9, but I wanted to finish the year and skate well enough to satisfy myself in a contest. So he skates for the rest of 1999, and then he retires from competing, which is a crucial point here. And he says, guess what? After I stopped skating contests, nothing changed. When I say nothing, I mean nothing in the skate world. It didn't make any difference to people on my side of the fence. Outside of skating, people freaked, which emphatically proved a point to me about the mainstream media. They don't get it. After all the years skaters spent trying to explain what we do and why we do it to non-skaters, it all fell on deaf ears. They treated me as though I was a football or basketball player when I stopped competing. They made it mean I wouldn't skate anymore. I must have explained it over 100 times in the month following my MTV event that I would only be retiring from competing, not from skating. I explained numerous times that competition isn't the only aspect of skating. No matter how big skating gets, no matter how many people around the world get it zapped into their living rooms or see it in movies, they won't understand skating until they go and do it. Coinciding with his retirement comes another huge milestone in his journey, but it was also a bit of a surprise to him, and he says, Activision came to me in September 1998 with a solid offer to produce Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which is the video game, of course. I thought I'd make a little bit of money off the game, but mostly I was amped to help create a good skating game. There was no way I thought it would take off beyond the skate world, but almost immediately it sold out in all the toy stores. Pro Skater was the best-selling PlayStation game of the 1996 Christmas season. And honestly, Greg, that game also helped bring skateboarding into mainstream consciousness. Skating made me who I am. I spent the better part of my summers and the majority of my weekends on the road from the age of 14, and I credit that for forming my personality. I was thrust into so many different situations that I learned how to deal with almost all of them. I was there. It was reality. I had to learn how to relate. I can't complain. I started out skating as a dirty, ratty little kid, and now I'm 32 years old and still rolling around. I never expected to make a career out of it, but here I am, with a beautiful family and more opportunities than I ever dreamed possible. And you know what? I can still walk out the front door, skate to the local school, or the curb at the grocery store and see no skateboarding signs almost everywhere I look. Skateboarding is not a crime, it's my career. Greg, that is where we'll leave it. And success leaves clues, so what are your top 10 life lessons?
Duncan, my top 10 life lessons from Hawk, occupation skateboarder. Number 1, passion can start as a spark. The things that change your life don't always start with instant passion. Curiosity can grow into obsession. He says, I didn't care. To me, it was just another play object. And of course, he's talking about his first skateboard. Number 2, your environment shapes you. Finding a community where you belong can be life-changing. He says, I was a skater, and inside Oasis's skate park gates, age didn't matter. Number 3, preparation separates the best from the rest. Mental preparation is just as important as physical skill. He says, before every contest, I'd draw the bowl and plan every trick. Number 4, success won't erase doubt. Even champions feel nerves, and the key is performing despite them. Hawk says, I was visibly scared before contests. My anxiety sometimes made me shake. Number 5, adapt or get left behind. Staying ahead requires constant evolution. Hawk says, my style of skating was becoming dated, and I was scared of being left in the dust. Number 6, resilience wins over talent. He says the 900 wasn't about talent. It was about persistence. He says, after 13 years of trying, all I could think was, finally. Number 7, success attracts scrutiny. The better you get, the higher the expectations, until winning is the only option. He says, if I didn't win, I lost. Number 8, fame is a double-edged sword. Visibility brings opportunity, but also unintended consequences. He says the X Games exposure overshadowed the rest of my team. Number 9, your biggest break can come from unexpected places. Sometimes the things that you least expect open the biggest doors. He said, I thought I'd make a little money off the game, talking about his multi-million-dollar video game. And finally, number 10, skating was never just a sport. The best careers aren't jobs, they're identities. And he says, skateboarding is not a crime. It's my career.
And Greg, as always, a fantastic top 10, but there are always lessons to avoid. So what are your top 10 lessons to avoid from Tony Hawk?
My top 10 behaviors to avoid from Hawk, occupation skateboarder. Number 1, chasing validation over mastery. If you rely on external validation, you'll never feel like you're enough. He says people only paid attention to how I placed. Number 2, ignoring the cycles of success. Nothing stays hot forever. Prepare for the downturns. He said skating's popularity had peaks and crashes, about 9 years. Number 3, letting comfort hold you back. Waiting for things to improve is never a foolproof strategy. He said, I anticipated 1994 would be the year skating picked up. Number 4, believing industry stability is guaranteed. Even if you're at the top, industries shift. Diversify early. He says by 1991, things financially were not looking good for me. Number 5, losing yourself in expectations. Don't let labels define your worth. He says, I didn't think I was the best in the world. 6, underestimating the power of reinvention. The game always changes. So should you. He said street skating overtook vert and my style was becoming dated. Number 7, forgetting why you started. When the joy is gone, it's time to take a step back. He said, I began to hate skating in contests. Number 8, assuming money will always flow. Even legends can struggle financially. You've got to plan for the long game. He says, I lost money doing demos just to promote Birdhouse, his company. Number 9, letting pressure dictate your path. External expectations can crush even the most talented if they're not managed. He says, I considered retiring at 19. And finally, number 10, thinking success means you're done learning. Even after a decade at the top, growth never stops. And he says, the 900 wasn't just a trick, it was a 13-year battle. Thank you so much for joining myself and Duncan on this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with people you know, and that will help us grow the show and keep doing what we're doing. If you get inspired, feel free to pop over and leave us a 5-star review. See you next time on Performers.